Hey, so we are wrapping up our final week of a series that we've been in, Above All Else. And throughout this series, if you've been a part of it, if you've kind of watched online, you know we've talked about things like acceptance and change, and we talked about sacrifice, and we talked about forgiveness. And the whole premise of this series came that really there was no such thing up until about 80 years ago of this idea of priorities, that there was only one such thing as a priority, that you can only have one thing be first. And in Jesus' kingdom, in Jesus' world, that one thing was love. That love was to be the thing that would be placed above all else. That love was to be the thing that would be kind of positioned above everything else. And so throughout this series, we've talked about different aspects or components of love and what it looks like to kind of live this out as a community and in relation to one another, and as we set out to do what God's called us to do. And when I think about love, I try to think about the purest form of love and what that may be or where that comes from. And for me, the purest form of love that I've ever experienced in my life was the day, not even the day, but the moment that the doctors placed Gia, my 6-year-old daughter, as a newborn baby in my arms. In that moment, it was like the wildest thing. I've never taken hard drugs, but I imagine this is what ecstasy is like. It was a moment where I had this, they put her in my arms, and then in an instant, all of a sudden I was overcome by love. And for no reason. In a relationship, we have reason to love, right? Because someone treats us good, because they're attractive, because they have a lot of money, or whatever the case may be. We have reasons that we've built up our love, reasons why I love this person, reasons why I love that person. But a child didn't do any of that. Gia, when she was born, did nothing of the sort. I mean, she was just born. And then she was there, and all of a sudden, my heart, my whole body, it was kind of this out-of-body experience where love was the supreme thing in my life in that moment. Now, of course, she's grown up, and she's no longer this little newborn baby, and so our love looks different. And one of the best things about being a dad, I guess, is that you get to kind of relive your own childhood through your own kid. And so you get to do fun things. I picked her up from school the other day, and there was a Mr. Softy ice cream truck. The dude was legit. He posted up right outside the school gate. And so he knew, this is the time to sucker all these parents in. And he got me. He just straight up got me. But that's what I grew up doing. Getting these Mr. Softy ice cream, like vanilla sprinkle cone. And so I, got one for Gia, and, to see the excitement and, her, with ice cream all over her face, walking home with this cone. It was, it's the best. Or a few weeks back, we went to the Bronx Zoo, which is the zoo I grew up going to. And so her telling me about all these kind of African animals that somehow she knows about that neither Chris or myself have ever educated her on. And somehow she's familiar with these things. And yet the awe and the wonder and the experience. And so as a dad, you get to kind of cherish those moments. And then, of course, recently we were over in the UK. And so we were in London, and I did the typical dad thing. There was this wall that was probably about 6.5 feet tall. And I had her go to the top, and I was trying to encourage her to jump, right? And I would catch her, not just jump off and break a leg, but jump and I'll catch you. If you're a kid or you remember back to your childhood, someone in your life did that, uncle, a dad, a family member, and jump off the bed or jump off the staircase, and they're inciting you, come on, jump. And inevitably they ask one of these questions, right? Or ask a specific question, and I'm gonna start it, but I want you to finish it if you know it, okay? When you're struggling or when the child is hesitating, I did this with Gia. She was not sure if she should jump. She's and I'm do you trust me? Thank you, Mary. Appreciate that. A+ student over here. She gets the answer first. Do you trust me? Do you trust me? And it's interesting because not only is it an odd question to ask, it also happens to be the title of this message, but really when you think about the premise of this question, by asking it, whoever's asking it is acknowledging that the person on the receiving end of the question, for whatever reason, there's some sort of absence of trust. By asking it, you're automatically recognizing the fact that there is an absence of trust. So to say, do you trust me? You're recognizing that person has reason, for whatever reason, a just cause to not trust you. And the absence of trust in this particular situation with Gia ended up creating a situation where maybe she was unwilling to jump. And she kind of withheld, and she was, kind of limited and not sure if she should do this. But the absence of trust in that particular situation is small compared to the absence of trust and an actual, in a real situation, in a situation that matters. More specifically, in the context of like personal relationships. Like the absence of trust can create some negative consequences, some harmful situations that we live in or that we operate in. And I've got 3 of them I'm going to share with you real simple. 3 like consequences when there's an absence of trust. The absence of trust equals limited engagement, poor understanding, and broken relationships. Limited engagement. You think about like going back to this illustration of Gia jumping off of a wall and standing there like, I'm there ready to receive her. I'm there ready to catch her. I've only dropped her once and she got a concussion, but that was a couple years ago. And so, but this time I'm going to catch her. Like I know it. And so, but this absence of trust like caused or created limited engagement. She's like, I don't know if I can do it. I don't know if I should do it. I don't know if it's safe to do it. So I'm going to withhold. I'm not going to engage to the level that I could because I just don't know if I can trust them. Now, in her case, she ended up jumping, so I'm a good dad. But when there's limited engagement, it creates poor understanding. Because if I don't engage fully with Mary over here, and if I don't engage with her to like in my entirety and my full authentic self and to understand her full authentic self, then what it's going to create is a gap where there's poor understanding. So she does something, and then I have reason to question her motive because I didn't engage fully with her. Or Eric does something, and all of a sudden, or I do something, and Eric, because he's chosen not to engage with me, he has a poor understanding of what I've done. And so it sets this up, and then ultimately leads to a broken relationship. Because you look at this situation and this progression, and what you realize is the absence of trust, without trust, you can't really have a whole integrated relationship. And the reason why I use this word relationship is because if we're talking about love, love happens within the context of relationship. You can't love someone you've never met. You can say, I love the world, or I love all people. But you don't really love someone outside of a relationship. And it's hard to have a healthy relationship when there's an absence of trust, because here's the problem with this. Relationships always and only move or grow at the speed of trust. They always and only grow at the speed of trust. You can't move or accelerate a relationship. You can't expect the relationship to go forward if there is no trust. Or if there's limited trust, or if there's broken trust, or poor understanding, or lack of engagement, or broken relationships, then relationships are going to be stifled. And so this thing of trust is hugely crucial. It's hugely critical. And Jesus himself understood this very thing. Jesus knew exactly the importance and the significance of this, and it's why he deliberately chose to place his disciples in situations where trust would have to be cultivated, where trust would have to be developed, where trust would have to be kind of the anchor and the bedrock, because we can talk about change, and we can talk about acceptance, and we can talk about forgiveness, and we can talk about sacrifice, but if we don't have this, then we've got nothing. And then I was sharing with a few people before, but this series, when we planned this thing out back in the beginning of March, I knew that this message would be the message that was preached on the final week of this series, because you can talk about all these other things, but if you don't lay it on the foundation or the bedrock of trust, what does acceptance mean? How does someone feel like you sacrificed for them? How does someone feel like you cared for them or that you actually truly love them apart from trust? And in this particular story that we'll look at, it's in Matthew chapter 14 if you want to open up over there, but we'll see what Jesus did and what he intended to do in order to develop and cultivate trust, and in order to kind of bring about trust in a way that maybe seems kind of not countercultural, but contrarian to what we would normally think. And so Matthew 14, verse 22 begins with this. Immediately after this, Jesus insisted, so back up, immediately after the feeding of the 5,000, okay? So he feeds thousands of people. He's with his disciples. So it says immediately after this, Jesus insisted that his disciples get back into the boat and cross to the other side of the lake while he sent the people home. After sending them home, he himself went up into the hills by himself to pray. Night fell while he was there alone. Meanwhile, the disciples were in trouble far away from land, for a strong wind had risen and they were fighting heavy waves. About 3 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came toward them walking on the water. And if you think that's weird, so did disciples, because it says when the disciples saw him walking on the water, they were terrified. In their fear, they cried out, "It's a ghost!" I would have used more explicit language. But Jesus spoke to them at once. Don't be afraid. Easy for him to say. Take courage, I am here. Then Peter called to him, Lord, if it's really you, tell me to come to you walking on the water. Yes, come, Jesus said. So Peter went over the side of the boat and walked on the water toward Jesus. But when he saw the strong wind and the waves, he was terrified and he began to sink. Save me, Lord, he shouted. So Jesus immediately reached out and grabbed him. You have so little faith, Jesus said. Why did you doubt me? When they climbed back into the boat, the wind stopped and the disciples worshiped him. You really are the Son of God, they exclaimed. Now, think about this situation, because I think a lot of times it's a familiar story if you grew up in church, if you've been around church for a while, and we look at it, oh wow, the faith to step out of the boat and all this stuff. Now, if you look up in a dictionary or a thesaurus, you'll find that faith and trust are essentially interchangeable. Okay? But we look at it from the context of like, wow, Peter walked on water. But we don't look at it apart from the context of what Jesus was actually trying to do, zoom out the big picture in this situation. You see, Jesus was trying to cultivate trust among his group. He had a very specific mission and a very specific purpose, but he also had a very limited time in order to prepare his disciples for this mission and for this purpose. He had 3 years with them, 3 years to change the world. Their mission, their purpose, take this message, this good news of Jesus Christ all over the world. Every country, every language, every people need to hear about this, and it's your responsibility to do it. So I've got to prepare you in order to do this. And here's the thing. When you do it and I'm not here, it's going to be hard. And so you've got to trust that what I said is true. You've got to trust that what I've called you to is important. You've got to trust that this is exactly why God put you on this planet. And so in order to get to that point of trust where that person could understand, yes, this is what Jesus wants me to do no matter what I face, persecution, death, slander, all these different things that they would encounter. Jesus knew it was going to require a strong level of trust. So he sent them into a predicament. It says Jesus sent them out into the lake, and Jesus was and is God, so he knew what they would face in the lake. He said, you guys go out, I'll stay back. Sometimes I think we wonder, like, man, God's messing with me. I'm in a tough situation. And God said, no, I'm not messing with you. I love you, so I put you in a tough situation. And so he sent them into the troubled water where they would have to face the reality that our Savior, that our God, that the person we're following led us out to this point. It was an invitation to trust. And then when they're struggling, when things are turbulent, when things are uncertain, Jesus comes walking on the water as if this is a normal thing to do in life. And he comes walking on the water, and he invites them to an even greater level of trust. Peter says, for whatever God knows why reason, Jesus, if it's you, let me come out and walk to you. So Jesus says, yeah, come on. Now imagine being Peter in this situation. Well, I said that, but I didn't really mean it. But now he told me to come out, so now I've got to actually do this thing. Like, and if you've ever been, like, we're not talking about like a cruise ship over here. We're talking about like this little rickety wooden boat. And so, like, if you've ever like climbed over a fence, you typically go like one leg at a time, right? Like you kind of lift, not when you're in skinny jeans because you're afraid they might rip, but like, you kind of lift like and go over, and then you put your foot down on the ground and you're fine. But that doesn't happen in a boat when it's on water. There's no like, all right, just 1 foot at a time and I'll be all right. It's like, okay, here I go. Are you sure, Jesus? I mean, you're halfway here now. I might as well just wait for you to come here. No, just come. Just come. So he steps over, and like, I mean, once 1 foot goes in, like you're going in. Like there's no like backpedaling. So he does it, and he puts a second foot, and now he's walking. And he's recognizing all of a sudden, I'm doing something that, as far as human recorded history goes, only Jesus has done. So me and Jesus are in this elite category of people who have walked on water. And it was because he was invited to a greater level of trust. But then things happen, things change, right? Like even though you go to a deeper level of trust in a relationship, even though you go to a deeper level of trust in your relationship with God, things still get a little bit uncertain and a little bit unsettled. And you start looking around and realizing, this is crazy. I can't believe I'm actually doing this. What was I thinking? And so he started to sink. And upon sinking, he cried out to God, he cried out to Jesus, and Jesus reached down. Think about how weird this is, right? Like, again, we think about this, we read this, but we don't think about the fact he reached out, Jesus, he's standing on water, He reaches down into the water to pull someone up out of the water. And what does he do? Does he like toss him back in the boat? He positions him to stand back on the water to demonstrate that he's worthy of being trusted even in the most dire of circumstances, even in the most troubling situations, even in the things where we have no idea. Because again, why? He recognized, I've got a mission for you, and this mission is too big, it's too critical, it's too crucial for you to step into it without knowing the fact that you can trust me in every situation you face in life. And I don't fancy myself to be Jesus, but I'm telling you right now, the mission we have at Meta Church is super critical. The calling that we have, this mission to help every person experience the transformative power of Jesus Christ, it's too big, it's too crucial to just kind of step into it without having this aspect or this dimension of trust in our relationships. In fact, I would go as far to say this, that we cannot accomplish the mission we've been given to the level we've been called if we do not have or incorporate trust in every single relationship we have with one another. And in case you think I'm playing, I'll say it again. We cannot accomplish the mission we've been given to the level we've been called if we do not have or incorporate trust in every single relationship that we have. We can't. This isn't like, if you're watching online, this like may be good for you, but this is for this. This is for this moment, for this room, for these people. Because trust is absolutely necessary. There's no escaping that reality. And you know this to be true even in your own personal relationships. You know that a relationship is always going to be limited when there's a lack of trust. You know that a relationship is always going to be stifled or prohibitive when trust is not there. Because the only relationships that function apart from trust are bad ones. There's no getting around that. There's no way of escaping that. The only relationships that function apart from trust are bad ones. The unhealthy relationships you have, the things that you're skeptical about, the people that you're not sure about. You ever had a situation where maybe you just connect with someone? And it's like right off the bat, you're like, whoa, we just hit it off, and boom, we're going at it, talking about all this stuff, and you would have thought we've been friends for a year, 2 years, 3 years. You ever had that happen to you? Yeah. But then on the flip side, maybe on paper everything looks like it should match up, and then you meet someone and it's like, nah, something's not right there. It's trust. Maybe that person doesn't trust you. Maybe you don't trust them. But there's just a rub, and that rub is a lack of trust. On the flip side, when everything goes great, you're like, man, I just felt at ease with this person. And so trust was the difference. Now, trust, the thing about it is that it takes long to build. And it can literally take just a moment to destroy. But in my experience, I say that to say this, I can't preach this message and then just say, okay, great, I preached the message on trust. Everyone trusts each other and we're great. That's just not how it's going to work. But in my experience, I've learned that there are some things you can do to accelerate the speed of trust in a healthy and honoring way. Not to bypass or to shortcut or to cut corners, but to cultivate true and authentic relationship and love in a trustworthy manner. And so what I want to do for the rest of our time this morning is kind of share with you these things that I guess I'll just call them for the sake of not being fancy, trust accelerators, these kind of 4 aspects of, or 4 things that can be done to accelerate the speed of trust. But with these 4 things, I'm going to share with you, I guess the only thing I know to call them is cancers. Things that eat away at trust. Because this is where it gets a little bit uncomfortable. Because when we talk about trust, everyone's like, oh yeah, I trust you, or I trust this, or we all know the importance and the significance of trust, but then our actions indicate that we actually don't care about trust the way that we talk about it. Because we will do things, we will allow for certain things to take root in our hearts, to take root in our behavior, to exemplify or to reveal themselves in our relationships, and they will deteriorate and eat away at trust faster than anything you can imagine. And that's why they can't be called anything other than cancer. And so as we go through this, it's going to be kind of a gut check thing. And I'm not just saying I'm preaching at you. I'm talking about for myself. As I preach through this message, as I work through this message, I think, okay, where am I allowing these things any sort of room in my life? Or where am I fighting with myself, not with somebody else? Because I'm trying to accelerate trust, but also allowing this to exist in my life. And so as we go through this, I'll share these things and I'll kind of position it at the end with maybe a bit of insight or challenge. So the first trust accelerator is this: commitment to one another and our cause. Commitment to one another and our cause. Trust is built when there's a mutual understanding that I'm committed to you and you're committed to me. And together, we're committed to our cause. Maybe the easiest way to think about this is like a group project in school, right? If you've ever been a part of a group project with more than like yourself, you've had other people involved. Everyone I know has had this experience to some degree where someone in the group didn't contribute to the level or the degree that everyone else did. So in doing so, not only did they commit, or not only did they demonstrate they weren't committed to you, but they also weren't committed to the cause, which is the success of that project. But as an accelerator, when I say I'm committed to Bronwyn, and when Bronwyn shows that she's committed to me, and together we're committed to making this thing work and to making it happen, we're demonstrating, we're accelerating trust because we know we're on the same page and we know we're moving in the same direction and we know we're doing it together. And that we're working towards something and we're building something. And when each of us in this room knows that we are working on trust or that we're committed to one another, we are laying and pouring the foundation for the tower of trust that's to be built. Now, the thing that eats away at this is gossip. There's not an easier or faster way to demonstrate that you're not committed to someone than gossip. And gossip, if you want a definition of it, or the way I look at it, gossip is simply you talking to someone who can't do anything about the situation when you're specifically speaking about someone else. It would be like me talking to Alex about an issue with Brooke or about something Brooke has done, but Alex has no say or authority or power to do that. Instead, I just want to kind of vent. But here's the thing about gossip. But gossip is really interesting because gossip requires two people. Not just someone to speak it, but someone to receive it. And the person who receives it is just as complicit as the person who spoke it. I heard a story of a guy who was so opposed to hearing or receiving any sort of gossip that he would literally, the moment he kind of sensed that this is where this conversation was going or that this is what that person was trying to do, he would do this. And he would turn his back to any person who attempted to speak gossip in his presence because he refused to be complicit in the gossip. I mean, you talk about like being committed to one another. Yeah, how can you be committed to one another if you're not even sure that the person you're committed to is actually like speaking something with you? Yeah. But they're quick to speak at someone else. So instead of being committed to someone else, you're quick to commiserate with someone else. Yeah. And it destroys trust before it ever had a chance to get started. And that's not to say that like, okay, everything's going to be good, because that leads to the second trust accelerator, which is this, is healthy conflict. Just because we're committed to one another doesn't mean that we won't encounter trouble, doesn't mean that we won't experience problems, doesn't mean we won't have disagreements, it doesn't mean that there's not going to be some sort of issue that comes up. But because we're committed to one another, that means we have the responsibility and the right to engage in healthy conflict with one another. Now, this is kind of intimidating, if I've got to be honest. I mean, not so much for me. I like conflict. But it's intimidating because I think we see such poor pictures of conflict. I mean, good God, we just got to walk down like 10 blocks and you'll hear someone like throwing their hands up and like screaming at someone and flailing like a freaking chicken. And it's like, no, that's not really what healthy conflict looks like. Or maybe it was a situation you had with your parents or your dad or your mom where they just always yelled at you, or they belittled you, or they shamed you, or they mocked you. And so that type of conflict is the only conflict that you see or that you know. I don't know, or maybe it's a situation with a boss who's just mistreating you, or a coworker, and so like that whole thing. Like we have these poor pictures of conflict. And so because we have these poor pictures of conflict, we choose not to get it. But if we have a genuine issue with someone, if we have a genuine problem with someone in this room, like we have the responsibility to go to that person directly, to voice our concern, and then have the expectation that that person will receive our concern. And so in this situation, in this type of moment, in what we're talking about, this is necessary. And the reason we don't do this, the cancer, if you will, is immaturity. Immaturity that reveals itself through jealousy and envy. Immaturity that reveals itself through insecurity. Immaturity that reveals itself through cynicism and skepticism. The person who's always negative, the person who's always critical. The person who's jealous that someone else got something and this person didn't. It's all immaturity. You might be 25 or 35, but you act like you're 5. That's what that is. I don't want to engage in healthy conflict because I'm too immature to have a face-to-face adult conversation with someone. And so instead, I'll get jealous. Instead, I'll write it off like, oh, well, they're the favorite or whatever it is. But that's how we act. That's immaturity. That's not who Christ has called you to be. That's not who Jesus was. It's not how Jesus treats you, nor is it how we should treat one another. So healthy conflict. The third trust accelerator is this: spiritual accountability. Now, before your mind starts running off to like what this could be, I'm not talking about being like the bus monitor, okay? Like, oh, like, Ricky, I saw that person smoking a cigarette. Like, okay, I mean, my motivation to get them to quit is so they can give $15 a month or a week more to the church instead of spending it on Newports. Whatever the case may be. Like, I'm not talking about that. Like, I'm not talking about like gotcha moments. I'm not talking about like accountability in the sense of like, okay, did you do anything wrong this week? Did you mess up? I'm talking about spiritual accountability, the kind that like spurs you to growth, the kind that inspires you to want to move forward, the kind that challenges you to step up, the kind that says, hey, I love you and I believe in you and I'm committed to you and I'm committed to seeing you get closer to Jesus because I want you to hold me to that same level of expectation. And so I'm going to be there for you. I'm going to encourage you in this. I'm going to challenge you in this. I'm going to inspire you where I need to inspire you. I'm going to be that type of person because I want to hold you accountable, not to what you did wrong, but your potential to do right. And I think the thing, the cancer or the fear the cancer that kind of damages this is fear. It's fear. I mean, think about this. How many of you have a friend that you know is a Christian? And you've been friends for a period of time. I don't know, it could be a long time, it could be a short time. But you've not had a single conversation about what God is teaching them. Oh, that's weird. I mean, this is private. It's kind of personal. Or like, it's fear. It's fear, and it debilitates trust. Well, how do I start that conversation? I don't know. Hey, so what's God teaching you? I mean, there's a start. But that's the thing, right? Like we're like afraid to like, well, I mean, we've never talked about that, so like I don't want to change the relationship. So what kind of relationship do you have if you don't have that? It's going to be limited as it is. And so spiritual accountability is massive. This should be the space where me asking Courtney about what God is doing in her life in the area of finances might be initially uncomfortable, but for the long term, she recognizes it's going to be for her benefit. Where Courtney's speaking about what God did in her finances or what God's doing and leading her into generosity isn't like, they just want money. It's like, no, man, God is working in her life. And money is the outlet through which this is like demonstrable. Where me speaking with Krista in my marriage about what God is doing me and the vulnerabilities that I have isn't something that's, it's kind of weird because she's a girl and I'm a guy. And like, we're married. She's my wife. It's our God. Spiritual accountability is a massive trust accelerator. Because again, when you go back to those kind of like dangers of like in the absence of trust, if we refuse to engage in this, then we set ourselves up for poor understanding and broken relationships. The fourth and final one I'll share with you is this: Christ-like compassion. This is what undergirds all of these things. This is kind of the glue, if you will, that holds all of this together. That behind spiritual accountability, that behind the commitment to one another and the cause, that what's kind of connected to all of this is the compassion that Jesus demonstrated to us, the grace, the mercy, the understanding, the humility. Because in none of these areas is it our responsibility to lord over someone else. We already have a Lord. We don't need to try to take his spot. In fact, instead of trying to take his spot, he chose, let me take your spot. And let me show you compassion on a human interaction level. See, Jesus didn't send his disciples out into the lake to mess with them. Oh, I got this funny idea. Watch this. Hey guys, go out into the lake. I'm just going to kind of hang up here on this mountain and watch what happens. Yeah, this is going to be good. They don't even know what's going to happen. He wasn't doing with that. He was sending them out into a predicament where trust would be needed and where trust would be developed and cultivated so that they could understand his compassion and his care and his love. The thing that, I guess, as I wrap up, the thing that strikes me about that particular passage in Matthew 14 is if you go back to verse, I think it's 33 or maybe it's 31. It's an odd number. I don't know why I know that, but I know it's an odd number. But if you go back to that verse, at the end of this kind of interaction, the disciples have like a really startling conclusion. Not startling to us because we know the story, but startling to them because they say, truly, you are the Son of God. Now, that may not seem like a big deal, but obviously this is Matthew 14. Matthew has 28 chapters, so we're halfway through Matthew's letter and Matthew's account. And halfway through his account is the first time that they recognize the real identity of who Jesus is. In fact, if you just do a little Google search, like in the book of Matthew, Son of God, the only times it's mentioned before Matthew 14 by the disciples is by the devils and demons. So they've been following Jesus. They've been seeing Jesus. They've been connected with Jesus. They've been walking and talking with Jesus. But the first time they recognized his identity was after they trusted. And I think sometimes we withhold trust because you say, well, I don't know them. But the only way you know them is when you trust. Because in that process of trusting, God has the opportunity to illuminate the person's identity and reveal their heart, reveal their character, reveal their motives. And in the process of trusting, again, because if you follow that progression, you have the opportunity to engage in healthy conflict where you can raise the question and say, hey, I don't understand why you did this. And not in a judgmental, condescending way, but in a manner that's honoring, in a manner that's gracious, and say, hey, will you help me, walk me through why you made this decision? But when we don't trust, we don't ever give ourselves the opportunity to know who's on the other side of that relationship. And so as I close, I'll kind of leave you with this thought because you can't force trust. Even Jesus, he was God, try as he might. He couldn't force trust upon his disciples. But you can invite people into trust. And so as I close this morning, I can't force you to trust one another. I can't force you to trust me. I can't force you to trust leadership decisions that will be made. I can't force you to trust relationship dynamics that are going to take place naturally. But I can invite you to trust. And the choice is yours. Ultimately, you have to determine, you have to decide, what type of person are you going to be? Are you going to be the person that chooses to trust? If you're going to be the type of person that says, hey, I want to, place love above all else. Hey, I want to live to love because that's what we're about as a community. Then it's going to require that you place trust. And so are you going to be that person? Or are you going to be the person that says, no, you know what? I'll withhold that. And this live to love thing, this above all else thing, this trust thing, that's not for me. I can't tell you what to do, but I can invite you. And I can invite you to trust. So with that in mind, let's stand. We're going to pray. And then I've asked Eric and Bronwyn to close this out with Same God once again. Jesus, today we come to you and we recognize, Lord, that you are placing us in situations where we are required, where we have to learn to trust you. But God, you've done so not out of out of some sort of weird thing for yourself, but to give us an example of how we can trust one another. Of how we can lean into that, of how we can live that, how we can become that. And so, God, I pray that through the words spoken today, Lord, not my words, but your words, Holy Spirit, in the hearts of our people, God, that you would instill in us an unshakable and immovable force that chooses to trust. God, when we have questions, we approach that conversation directly, that we hold each other spiritually accountable because we see the potential in one another. God, that we show and demonstrate our commitment to each other. God, that we would remove any of these cancers of fear, of immaturity, of gossip, of these things, God, that we're so quick to allow into our lives. God, that we would remove them through the power of your Holy Spirit and through the authority given to us in Jesus Christ. So we pray all this and we lift this up before you. In Jesus' name, amen.